Let's continue looking at how industrialization begins to impact the home. So we're going to talk about lower class women and middle class women. So we'll talk about middle class women first. But as I noted at the beginning of the semester, again, women's identity is not all the same. So here we have two examples of people doing the same thing, yet it has a different impact in the household. A good example of this is what you read for this week, looking at those middle-class women who are trying to help these poor women. And if you recall the reading, basically what it argued is that poor women need to act like middle-class women, right? And it's almost ridiculous because they can't afford to. But that is part of that kind of reform agenda that these evangelical women had towards these working class women, and it provides great examples where if they couldn't, then they wouldn't get any help, right? So here we're looking at middle class women to see how this new economic system shapes their life. So like today, history doesn't change much, right? Not that you follow this, but for the most part, it's still in play, because we see how this concept of the American dream shapes our identity. So this is pre-1900s, which is when the American dream kind of really takes hold. But we find that even in the 1830s, the home becomes a status symbol. And that's probably still true to today, right? Where the home represents, this economic identity that we all have, both as men and women. Men as, look what I can provide, and back then at least, women, look what my husband bought me. And today, these things that we buy within the home are also these kind of status symbols that we have. Things like, stainless steel appliances and, granite countertops or white kitchens, right? That's the new thing right now. Wooden floors, right? Even cars, right? Certain brands. I'm not sure if anybody out there drives a Yugo, but if you have a Mercedes or Audi or whatever it may be, sitting out in your garage, these are all status symbols that we can display to the society, saying, look how successful I am. So for middle class women during this era, their life revolved around, as I said earlier, around the home and around taking care of their family. So this is something that's not new to you, because you probably heard this already. But a lot of their time was consumed by taking care of their kids. Now the major difference between middle class women and working class women is that they saw their kids as an investment. So they had to teach them morals, teach them skills that they're going to use in the workforce eventually. So you're kind of getting them ready, right? And we still kind of see this today, right? There's still elements of this. Middle class women, however, though, they were not just kind of soccer moms sitting around reading novels or anything like that. They were working, and they were working quite hard to make sure that things got done. So this comes from a study done by, I think it's called Home and Work, by Professor Boydston. And she looks at these two different classes of women, and she finds that middle class women were working just as hard as any other group of women at this time in the home. They were sewing. They did hire help, but they hired help only when they couldn't do all their work. When they had to cook, they didn't have maids, so they had to do everything from scratch, unlike today, right, where maybe you have leftovers, you have a microwave, you can order in. Back then, a woman, a mother, had to cook everything from scratch, had to go to market more or less every day and buy these goods. When she did laundry, these were no easy tasks. This study focuses out in New York. So, it's not like there's laundromats during this period. You have to go to a particular location to do all this. there's also no indoor plumbing really during this era. I think it's not until the 1850s where indoor plumbing begins to take off, and even then it's only for the middle class, for the bourgeois. Cleaning, like I said earlier, right? We know this very well in Arizona. You clean your house one day, and by the next day it's all dusty, and you're kind of puzzled as to where dust comes in, because again, everything's closed. Back then, all that kind of soot that the factories created crept into your house, so this created more work for you to do, right? The environment that you lived in created more labor. They had gardens, took care of animals, they grew herbs and things like that. So they were working out in the field, right? And small gardens in their backyards, right? They used money. Money by the into the early 1800s begins to be the means of purchasing things, right? Purchasing goods. The barter system essentially is eliminated by this period because it's no longer useful. People are wanting to make money, so barter seems to go away with the colonial era. As I said earlier, when they hired people, they didn't mean that they could sit there and relax. A lot of times they hired women who were coming out from the country into the city, and they had to break their old habits, right? Or, their techniques of doing things, so they had to teach them, which took more time. And we find that many of the people that they did hire, only stuck around for maybe a year or two. After that, they would find a better job, and then they would move on, which meant that I had to hire somebody else, retrain them, took time. And a lot of times when they did hire people, it was only because they couldn't complete certain tasks. So they were still working, and the person that they hired was only doing jobs that they couldn't get to. So it's not like just them having maids, like places in England that it's very typical over there. And these women, again, they're working in all these jobs, right? But they're also finding ways to make extra money. So they're selling everything from flowers, they're taking in sewing, and a lot of rags. I have to go back and read why there's so many rags around. I think they collected them. I can't remember. Collected bottles, papers, right? Sold eggs, berries, whatever they could, in other words, to make ends meet. And remember, these are middle-class women. These are women who are well off. So that should tell you something about how hard it was to be a housewife in the 1830s. Now, lower-class women, there are some similarities. Look, they're looking for rags too, right? But they had that kind of double duty where, yes, they had to take care of the household, but they also had to go out and make some money. So they sold whatever they could, any kind of, any baked goods, any candy, coffee, whatever, right? The point is that working class women needed to bring in supplemental income. But they also worked at home, right? The unpaid labor that they do in the house, which mimics some of the middle class. They had to wash, chop wood, sewed, cook food, had to go up and down stairs carrying waters and things like that. So it's very laborious in doing some of these tasks, particularly unlike middle class women who live in these kind of suburbs of New York. Working class women live in what are called tenements, right? These kind of poor working class areas that have many levels, and they have to go up and down, right, into their apartment in which they live. So there's a lot of work. Unlike middle class women, these women had to cut corners. They had to scavenge for food, scavenge for clothing, for utensils, for fuel, whatever they could, right? Because to buy coal, it's expensive. Not everybody has it. So if you could find wood out in the street, they would use that as a fuel source. They made social networks during this period, and by this we mean they connected with different community members in order to find the price of cheap goods. So this became important because it does kind of mimic the industrial market where you want to know where you can buy the cheapest goods to save money. When it came to childcare, unlike middle-class women, they focus more on teaching their kids how to survive rather than teaching them how to, be educated, right? So they taught them how to scavenge and really have their kids work because many of them are an expense, right? So they need to, as soon as they can walk, they can contribute to the family income. This is something that we still see today. I know when I was growing up, my father had me working since the age of at least 7. I would have to go to where he worked and help him there, whether it was sweeping the shop or he does upholstery, so stripping the furniture of the material so I can get them ready to upholster. And I would get no money, maybe I'll get taken out for a sandwich or something like that. But the idea is that, well, you need to contribute to this household in some shape or form. All right, well, now women did work. So the examples I just gave you are those who have maybe the ability to stay home in some shape or form. But women did work, and we find that even when they were getting paid a salary, obviously they're making less than men, but it's also very different from the way men worked. So there's a town in Lowell, Massachusetts, where I think they produce shoes. I think that's what this example was, and they implemented what was called the Lowell system. So I'm going to explain that. Now, we begin to see, as I stated earlier, migrants moving from the country, like the countryside, right, to the city. So something like somebody moving from Tonopah to Phoenix, right? And most of these were young women, in their teen years, and they were single. And this became a bit of a concern to some of these factory owners and community members. So what they implemented was a system to make sure that these women wouldn't get out of control, if you will. So what they did is that they would make women work long hours for 6 days a week, and they would pay them very little. And the theory behind this is that it has multiple, not just one, but part of the theory is that you keep them busy, they're not going to be doing other things that they shouldn't be doing, according to them. So if you're working 13-hour days, 6 days a week, you're just too exhausted to do anything outside of that. Even on your day off, you probably just want to sleep. When it came to housing, rather than have them live within the city, they had them live in a boarding house within the factory. So that way they can kind of watch them, because they feared that if they lived in the city, it could lead to prostitution. So this was a very paternalistic system that basically limited women's ability to have their own agency. So this is this kind of form of American democracy, right? American capitalism that is created in order to limit women's ability to be completely independent. Also, by living in these boarding houses, they would have to buy all the goods from some of these places. So sometimes they charge just exaggerated prices, and they didn't have much money to begin with, yet most of it's going just to survive. Now, when it comes to the idea of housework in this period, and I think either you already did or you're going to do an activity that puts a value on housework, we find that housework, particularly in this area, is really difficult to do. We find that, as I mentioned earlier, pollution creates more work for many of these women. We find that women had to adjust to new concepts of industrialization. For example, they had to be conscious of the time. Their husbands would go out in the morning, then come back at a certain time. So their schedule had to meet his schedule. I mean, it's no coincidence that we eat, at 5 or 6 p.m., right? Because it's, kind of related to our working schedule. So these things don't come out of a vacuum. So housework itself becomes very industrialized, in other words. Technology emerges during this period. Obviously this is the industrial era. So new technology emerges. And sometimes when we look at technology, we think, wow, this is good because it makes our life easier. And sometimes you have to step back and say, well, does it? Quick example, our cell phones, right? We thought cell phones were just going to make life so great because you have the internet and this and that, right? And you're probably right now listening to this lecture with a cell phone right next to you, maybe watching the lecture and also watching your phone because you need to be connected, right? On the same way, I was on my phone. I think I went on vacation and I had my phone with me because at that time I was division chair and making sure that whatever emails came in, I answered them while I was at the Colosseum or at the Vatican. So again, even though we think technology is good, it might be, it also creates more work because now I was always on the clock. Even though I was on vacation, I was still on the clock. And this is no different where you have things like, stoves, indoor pumps, boxes, ice boxes, sewing machines, right? All these great gadgets are just creating more work. Oh, you got a sewing machine? Now you can make clothes, right? You got utensils and dishes. Oh, you got these things? Okay, well, now you can wash them, which means you have to go get water, right? That's why it's nice being Mexican-American because you just put everything on tortilla and you eat your utensils and your dishes there, right? Women become dependent on the budget. Again, this is the idea that housework becomes industrialized. They need to keep records. They need to keep accounts. They're the ones who are basically the accountant for the family, seeing the money coming in, the money going out. Because a lot of times they're the ones who are buying the goods. So they need to know this information. And then they establish economic networks that follow their husbands' businesses. So a lot of times wives connect with other wives. And they get information that helps the household through these networks that they create. And like in any company, if you know anything about running the business, right, you don't throw anything away. Everything can be reused in some shape or form because when you throw something away, that's money that you're throwing away. Well, the household kind of follows that model where now everything must serve a purpose, and if you're going to throw it away, you better have a good reason to throw it away. Become a hoarder after that, right? Collect all this stuff. It makes women dependent on the market, right? They have to know how the prices of goods, what to buy, when to buy, and how necessary it is to buy these products. Maybe today we're doing the same thing, right? I know I look at my pantry and I'm like, why do we have all this stuff? Why did we buy this? And there's so much money in there, right? So again, no different from today. When it came to health, well, the mother basically became the doctor. They had to make sure that everybody was healthy to go to work, to go to school, right? To go to for the kids to go out and work in the streets. So that put more pressure on her. And again, we still see that today. I know when I get sick, I'm completely passed out, and basically my wife kind of takes care of me. But when she gets sick, I go, well, I'm going to go to work. Good luck with that, right? So we see this idea that it's women's responsibility to take care of everything in the household. If you were to put a price, I'll go through this kind of quick because, again, you do have an activity where I want you to put a price to the labor of these tasks that are done on a weekly basis. What would it be? Well, back then, if you had to pay somebody to cook and do the laundry, it would be about $3. To sew, another $2. For childcare, another $2 a week. So it would be about $4 on average that they bring into the household. Plus add another 40 cents to $2 to things that they sold, or if they sold eggs, that extra income that they bring in during this period. Maybe they do what's called outwork, where companies bring them fabric to make, let's say, textiles, which is clothing, and they bring them not textiles is like the fabric, but they bring them the fabric so they can make something out of it. And since they have a sewing machine, they can make extra money. Well, that's what housework was. So they made an extra $20 a year. So when it comes to women's unpaid labor, and this is basically the argument that this is showing you, and what this author is arguing, is that when it comes to women's unpaid labor, it contributes to the economic system, but in ways that you just don't see, right? Because they're not getting paid to do it, particularly again, the sewing, the cooking, the cleaning, all that stuff. It's not noticeable to most people that they are contributing to the economic system. So the total on average for a year was about between $250 to $600 a year, basically in savings. If you had to pay a woman to do these tasks during this era, it would come between $250 to $600 a year. Now, on average, a person in order for a person to survive during the 1830s to 1840s, they needed about $225 to survive during this era. And most people did not make anywhere near that, right? So if you had to pay somebody to do all these tasks for you, you could not afford it, right? Middle-class men made about $225 a year. And that's how much women were saving you at the minimum, right? Pretty darn close to that. An unskilled worker, which is your average worker, made only about $175 a year. So you can see that women's unpaid labor does contribute to the economic system. It's just not recognized. And by looking at this number, it is quite a bit, right? It's a yearly salary in savings that they contribute. So today you might have the same situation at home where whoever stays at home does all these tasks and they're actually saving you money, right? And I mean, just think about eating out every day. I think if I had to pay to eat out every day, I'll probably spend for a week maybe $200. It gets expensive, right, to eat out. Whereas if you buy groceries and somebody makes that food for you, it probably costs you about a week on average. You buy maybe $70 to $80, right, worth of groceries. So that's a savings of about $130 right there. Now, how does this help industry? Well, it helps the employer, believe it or not. So somebody working at home, right, being at this period a housewife, actually helps a company, and in the big picture. Why? Because particularly back then, if a woman is cutting all this cost to do all these household chores, it means that an employer, her husband's boss, can actually pay him a lower wage, right? The wife is saving so much money that he's always able to cut costs. If you know anything about business, certain costs you can control. Some of it you can't. The cost of material you can't control. The cost of a building you cannot control. The cost of machinery you cannot control. But the one thing that you can control is the cost of labor. So this allowed employers to pay workers below substance. And we find that in this period of the 1830s to 1840s and kind of into the 50s, we find that companies averaged about 20% profit in places like New York, which allow them to remain competitive by keeping the cost of labor low. And remember that a lot of this has to do because women were doing so much work in the home, therefore saving their family household money, and the employer can pay them less, right? So it was always a way to help the family, but companies were making money off them. And again, every company is always looking for ways to save money, to reduce the cost of production. And even if the employer paid a livable salary, what we find is that, particularly if you ever study economic history, in the last 100 years, our economy has been so stable for the most part, with the exception of maybe the Great Depression. Yes, we've had recessions here and there, but for the most part, our economy has been fairly stable. But if you ever look at the economy from the 1800s that kind of 100-year period, it's just a roller coaster. You have booms, you have busts, and you have depression after depression after depression. And right now we might be heading into a depression, but things are not as bad as they were back then. So the economy is always being so unstable. Women's unpaid labor always created a bit of a safety net, right? That way they don't, families do not sink to a lower economic class. So going back to that argument, does women unpaid labor contribute to the economic system, and does that mean for us to reconsider the idea of them having a vote? Well, Boydston, the author of this study, argues yes. Household work does become industrialized. It becomes tied to this kind of Republican motherhood. But we find that housework does have a value, even though we can't put a set price to it. But they are important to the economic system because they do save people money. Therefore, women should have been given the vote early on in American history. All right, so we'll stop it there. Hopefully you're able to do the activity on the price of housework, because I want you to put a price to some of these tasks today, right? If you had to pay somebody to do the cooking, do the laundry, babysit, all those type of things, how much do you think that labor, just the labor itself, costs? So do the activity, and I hope you have fun with it, because it's something that's still important today, and something that people still look at today. And maybe you appreciate whoever does the housework in your home a bit more. All right, so we'll stop it there.